I've been thinking some more about the implications for free will that those famous experiments that Libet carried out have. What they seem to suggest, and what one of the common interpretations of those experiments is that this idea that we have free will is something of an illusion, given that those experiments demonstrate pretty conclusively that when we make choices, those choices begin to be initiated in some parts of the brain before we are consciously aware of those choices actually being made. I think it's called the readiness potential begins to build in the brain before, as I say, before those choices actually are consciously made. So it seems that from that, or one of the common understandings of that, is that this idea of consciousness with all its willfulness and its intentionality is kind of following along in the wake of processes which are non-conscious. It reminds me of when I used to take my kids to amusement arcades when they were little. They would just as happily play machines in which I hadn't put any money as they would machines that had put money. They would hold on to the motorbike controls or the joystick whilst it was in demonstration mode, sort of following the actions that were being made on the screen as if they were controlling it. And they seemed to have as much fun out of that, really. It seemed to get as much a sense of an illusion of control. They seemed to be getting a sense of as much control from that as when they actually put the money in and really played the game for real. More so in many ways, because of course when they were very young they weren't very good at video games, so they didn't last very long. Whereas the demo mode lasted for ages. So there's this understanding of Libet that it seems to suggest that consciousness is kind of like a slick politician, just following, riding the wave of neural opinion and just taking responsibility for those actions, even though it isn't doing it. I know that's been heavily critiqued, and that's quite rightly so, I think. But I'm just curious of what would it be like if that gap, that whatever it is, 200 milliseconds gap between the rising of the readiness potential and conscious awareness, what would it be like if that gap was increased somehow? Let's say to 5 seconds. So there's a 5-second gap between the beginning of the action and one's conscious awareness of that action. So, for example, an example I've used before, you put your hand on a hot plate, and the sequence of events is if you take your hand off of that hot plate really quickly because you're getting a pain response, or you take your hand off quickly because something was happening, and then you get a pain response which you are conscious of. So the consciousness of the pain follows slightly after the beginning of the movement of the hand. We know that. Let's say that was 5 seconds difference. So you'd put your hand on the hot plate, the hand would come off, and then there'd be 5 seconds before you experience the pain, I guess, but before you experience this sensation of choice and willful removal of that hand. What does that mean? Would it still feel like you were making an intentional move? Would you feel like if you were observing yourself from a distance? A little bit like an avatar in a video game. A conceptual distance, of course, not a real distance. And what would it look like to an outside observer? Given that the action that you carried out, in this case moving your hand for a hot plate, it could be any action, given the action that you carried out would always be in line with what you would do anyway, with true nature, if you like. Whatever you would normally do, you would do that. I mean, would you get this feeling of smug satisfaction that your body was somehow magically carrying out your commands somehow 5 seconds in the future? Would you get this sense of agreement with every decision that your body was making? Or would you get a different sense of consciousness entirely? I suspect it's probably the latter. I'm not sure if you could feel fully conscious given that gap between action and intention, or between response to a stimuli and the feeling of control over that response. I'm not sure you would be conscious in the same way. I suspect it's more likely that somehow your consciousness would be kind of smeared across that 5-second gap, in the way that it's kind of smeared across the few 100-millisecond gap that exists at the moment. I don't think you could observe your body in that sort of distant way. Maybe you could, but I don't think you could. And just find this overpowering sense of agreement with everything that your body does.